Hello, everyone, and thanks for taking some time out of your day to join Real Story Group's webinar today on a very exciting topic for us on how to successfully navigate a changing CDP landscape. As you can see, I'm joined today by our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, along with our VP of Research, Apoorv Durga, who are going to be taking us through the heart of today's presentation. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here, and as we get started, I just want to mention a couple quick things. We will have time at the end for questions and feedback, so if you do have any questions that you'd like to share, you can just enter those into the questions tab and then go to webinar control panel. You will also be able to take a look at these slides. They will be sent out in a couple days by our marketing team, so keep an eye out for that. And for our subscribers on the line, you'll also always have this available to you in your subscriber library, along with the rest of our recorded webinars over the years. So keep an eye out for that as well. Do see a lot of new names on our attendee list today, and welcome. Certainly appreciate your time today, and wanted to share a little bit of background about Real Story Group. Tony founded this company 20 years ago, and he likes to tell the story that it was almost founded out of frustration because what he was reading at the time with the analyst reports wasn't matching his experience with the different technology products that were out there. So our company is focused on you as a technology user and buyer, okay? So we never work for or advise the vendors we cover in any way, as our focus is to share with you what these different vendors and solutions do well, but sometimes more importantly, what they don't do so well and where they might fall short for you. One of the hottest topics for us of late has been CDPs, and so it's a confusing landscape at times. A lot of new players coming in and out. So Tony and Apoorv are going to take it through a way of how to make sense of all that change. So Tony and Apoorv, I'll send it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Many of you will have seen this MarTech stack vendor map that we've done, and the CDP vendors are, of course, on the orange line, and there's a lot of them. It's a highly fragmented marketplace. But more generally, I share this because I think with each passing quarter, it becomes more critical to understand where are there intersections, not just vendor intersections like you see here, but where does CDP fit into your broader stack? And there's been a lot of evolution of thinking around that, certainly among the larger enterprises that we work with, and also vendors out in the marketplace kind of responding to this. And our notion of what a CDP is and what it should do is shifting accordingly. And so what Apoorv and I are going to try to capture today is what are some of those shifts, how should you think about it, and how should you respond? So we're going to start today with shifting architectures, and then we'll get into the marketplace and the right way to select a CDP. So with respect to shifting architectures, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Apoorv, who's going to take us through some initial kind of contextual analysis on this.
Thank you, Tony. Hello, everyone. So this slide is our services reference model for MarTech, right? So a lot of you must be familiar with or might be familiar with these kind of stacks. So on the top, there are these engagement channels. These are the channels that you or the brand uses to interact with users. And then there are some interaction and delivery environments or interaction and delivery services beneath that. And then there are content and engagement services. Now, a lot of you will have similar stacks. Of course, the exact boxes will vary, but the idea will be similar. Now, traditionally, each of these boxes have had their own content, data, and rules, thus creating several silos or islands, each operating on its own, right? So each of them had their own set of content repositories, own set of data repositories, and so on. However, the modern stacks address this problem by abstracting those content, data, and rules in a separate layer of its own that we call foundation services. That's the bottommost layer here, right? So essentially, this allows you to abstract all of your content, data, and rules away from channel specific products, and therefore allowing you to work better in an omni-channel world. So you see there are three broad categories of services there. So you have the content services, content and info services on the left, which consist of omni-channel content services, digital asset management, and product information management. And then you have the data services in between. So you have the customer data activation, customer data operations, and analytics and data intelligence. And finally, on the right, you have the rules or the decisioning services that basically include uh, A/B testing, experimentation, personalization, journey orchestration, and so on. For this session, though, we will focus on the data part, which is the middle here. So which is what we'll see in the next slide. Next slide, please, Tony.
Yeah.
So this slide is really an expanded view of the customer data layer that we saw in the previous slide. So essentially, this is how traditional CDP model worked. So you ingested data from scores of zero, first, and second party data sources. Some of those examples of those data sources are mentioned on the left here. So profile, mobile activity, customer service, product interaction, e-commerce, and so on. And then you apply several data management aspects to this ingested data. So you would transform that data, you cleanse that data, you normalize that data, you create customer 360 profiles, you segment data, and so on and so forth. Once you have those clean profiles of your users, you then do what is commonly known as activation, right? Which basically means that you activate all of that data or profiles for downstream marketing activities. So for example, you can segment that data, or you can do simple calculations such as extracting segments based on LTV or spends or other factors, and then you activate those segments, meaning you use them for personalization, running campaigns, doing advertising, or running analytics. Now, early CDPs wanted to or claim to do most of these tasks mentioned in the middle box, which is the customer data platform services. But as the industry matured, we are now seeing this new model emerging, in which there are two distinct categories or sets of services as shown on this slide. So this is the emerging model of CDPs, right? So there are two distinct categories here. There is customer data management and customer data activation. Now, a lot of organizations have an existing data fabric or an existing ecosystem of data warehouse, data lake, maybe an MDM, etc. And they are saying, we are already doing many of these tasks elsewhere, so why do we need to use, or we need a CDP to do those again, right? So think of this as a separate set of services or capabilities. You might end up using the same CDP or a single CDP to do both of those, but they are logically and functionally separate. And we see several organizations relying on their existing ecosystem or existing data fabric to carry out activities mentioned in the customer data management box here. In fact, we see several variations of this architecture, and Tony will speak a bit more about it later in this session. Now, CDP vendors understand this is happening, which is why many of them now partner with third-party vendors for things like ID resolution and some of the other advanced data management capabilities. So anyways, the key takeaway from this slide is that the emerging model of CDP architecture separates out data management and data activation more clearly than it did before. And you may use a CDP to do both the services or just one of them. A little bit of trivia here. So I started a LinkedIn poll yesterday that asked people what's their primary usage of CDP. The options were data management, activation, or both. Now, well, it's too early to conclude because it's been just one day, but there are already some interesting results there. The both options still got maximum responses, but there are a decent number of responses that have voted on either data management or data activation, thus supporting our hypothesis. Also maximum people who voted on both are from vendor companies, which is not really surprising.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So that's a great setup for the whole concept here. And I wanted to dig into it in a little bit more detail to sort of break this down into services. So going left to right, there's kind of four main categories that we might think of here. One is sort of core data services in the dark blue. These are sorts of things that your enterprise is already doing for all the different kind of data types that it's managing. And then this notion then on top of that, layering more of a customer data hub. So in core data services, you have ingestion, cleaning, processing, probably some modeling and predictions as far as things that you might layer on top of a data lake, like some ML operations or things like that. Then the customer data hub aggregates and unifies all of that data. It doesn't necessarily make it very exposable, but brings it together in a coherent way, particularly on unification and ID resolution, but also then some data enrichment, some stewardship and governance, particularly with respect to compliance and consent, and then some reporting perhaps out of a data warehouse, and then really importantly, giving some sort of an API or a queue or a pipeline or a product to then expose that data where it needs to go. And then one environment of where it needs to go would be with respect to customer data activation, where you're doing more real-time interactions, maybe doing some light processing, but the big thing that you're doing is segmenting content for marketing and customer engagement, activating that data, triggering events, and so forth. So as Apoorv mentioned, the potential scope for CDP could be across, certainly the three boxes on the left and potentially even part of the purple box of customer engagement on the right. But in a large enterprise environment, what we're seeing maybe even more commonly is that the dark and light blue box is already handled by other systems in the enterprise, and what they're really looking for is just out of a CDP might be customer data activation. So as Apoorv mentioned, there's no right or wrong here. It's just that we're seeing different patterns emerge, and certainly there's more than two patterns here. There's a wide variety of mixing and matching that's going on in the industry. But the larger the enterprise, I think the more from an architectural perspective, we're seeing both the interest in and the value of decomposing these into separate logical spaces. One that's kind of owned by IT and data ops that includes some sort of customer data hub. And another that's orange, that's owned by marketing and CX ops, which is where the data activation is actually happening. And the other thing that this speaks to, it's really interesting that we're seeing as a model here, is the fact that more than just marketing needs access to this customer data hub. Is that what we're seeing in a lot of enterprises is different silos basically trying to build this customer data hub out at the edge. So as we see finance departments trying to build a customer data hub, certainly delivery, fulfillment, execution, whatever that means in your enterprise, customer care, certainly marketing with respect to customer data activation. And then the most common place where we see a customer data hub getting built is in enterprise data intelligence, because the reporting and analysis and modeling functions need a unified customer data record to actually act on it. So we actually see some of that stuff happening within or around data warehouses and data lakes. The problem with doing it in any one of those places is then it's not exposed to all of the others. So the argument here is that particularly a larger enterprise is probably going to want to have a unified customer data hub that can then feed all of these different masters. And it would do that through data pipelines or data products. However, you do that within your enterprise, in which case the marketing box in orange is just one more endpoint for the unified record. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily the right architecture for you, but we are seeing this as an emerging pattern, particularly for larger enterprises, and it to some extent, it pulls apart the traditional notion of what a CDP is, and it has profound implications for what's the right CDP vendor then for you. So if we look at this by going back to our original stack, certainly, what services could you get from a CDP, and then what services should you get from a CDP? Well, if we just look down here at the data cone, certainly customer data activation, that's got to be the core of any CDP. Whether you wanted to do the customer data operations and management to be that customer data hub, maybe yes, maybe no. Do you want it to be handling your enterprise data intelligence? I think, again, for most of you, the answer is going to be no, but for some of you, that might make sense. We're working with a small media company right now where they're probably going to base most of their enterprise data intelligence around their CDP. Then over here, in terms of decisioning, we see some organizations successfully couple their decisioning with their data, at least in the near term, while that marketplace matures. And some CDPs even offer outbound marketing. So, so there's various issues of scope here. Then it's really important to get at least somewhat clear about that before you venture into this marketplace. Let's talk a little bit about venturing into this marketplace, and I'll remind you that you can ask questions in the GoToWebinar control panel that's on your screen, and we'll definitely have time to get to those questions. So I like to start this part out with a little bit of a joke. What if CDP vendors were Game of Thrones characters? Maybe this is what it would look like. And I think this is a perception of the market, that there's all these different players raising a ton of money, clawing at each other. But the reality is right now, this is not a particularly combative marketplace where one CDP vendor is killing off another. This is not Westeros. It's a much more pleasant environment where a rising tide is lifting all boats. And we suspect that most of these vendors, unlike Game of Thrones characters, are actually going to survive into the next season. So we worry a little bit less about vendor viability and a little bit more around what's the right fit for you. There's different dimensions of fit we'll see. We're obviously emphasizing architectural shifts, but that's changing the way that we look at the marketplace too. So with that, I'll turn it over to Apoorv to talk a little bit about how to categorize the CDP marketplace.
Okay, thank you, Tony. So we changed or we revised our categorization. We used to have only 2 categories earlier, but now we have 3 categories here. Right. So these 3 categories are, the first one is what we call MarTech suite dependent. Right. So these are essentially CDP offerings from major MarTech vendors, the big enterprise software vendors. They can either be processing or engagement oriented, but the key thing to note about them is that these vendors usually bind their CDPs very, very tightly to the rest of their suite, right? So instead of CDP being an independent layer, it's really part of the suite and binds very tightly with other products in their suite. So for example, Aqua CDP, they will probably offer it to you as a standalone, but they would prefer it if you bought it as part of their marketing suite, which means that it works with their personalization and campaign management tools, and in that sense, overall capabilities are split across multiple tool sets within this suite. The second category here is called processing oriented independent vendors. So these are independent vendors or standalone CDP vendors that focus more on data management aspects. So that includes things like data ingestion, profile unification, data cleansing, data stewardship, ID resolution, and so on. And finally, the third category is engagement oriented independents. So these are the independent vendors that focus more on activation or engagement. So that include things like journey orchestration, recommendations, personalization, marketing campaigns, and so on. You will notice that the third box is pretty crowded. The main reason, of course, is that like we've discussed, that some companies choose to do data oriented tasks elsewhere. There are other reasons too. So data management and ID resolution are hard problems to crack, and so some vendors have literally given up on those in lieu of depending on partners. Also, the engagement layer is more front end and sexier and all of that. So we see a lot of vendors actually moving from data to the engagement side of the things. Yeah. So next slide, please, Tony. So this is another way of visualizing the marketplace. So this is something that we have used successfully several times in the past. So this essentially shows 3 axes. Those axes are like the data lifecycle stages. So there is data management on the left, there is primarily activation on top, and then there is primarily data analytics on the right. This is sort of a spectrum, and vendors are plotted against these axes. So as you can see, not all products excel at all stages of the life cycle or all three of these stages. Most excel in one or two areas uh, at max. Okay, so back to you, Tony, for taking us through the right way to select these vendors.
Yeah, so you can make too much out of this cartography, and certainly the slide before that had neat boxes. As analysts, we like to put things in neat boxes and plot them, but the reality is that if you look across the various 30 or so services that we showed on the slide earlier, different vendors mix and match them in different ways. This is something we've been tracking very closely. So even though we may plot a vendor in one location or another, they may do one or the other thing that might be somewhat exceptional that would be outside of that category. So even though we create categories, we also encourage you to be a little bit skeptical about categorization as well. But we know that many of you are looking at CDPs, and so we always like to talk about the right way to select it, partly because my colleague Jared and I wrote a book on this topic. We saw many large enterprises really frustrated with waterfall-based approaches to technology selection. We thought there ought to be a better way to describe what had a methodology that we had really evolved over the past 20 years or so to apply more design thinking, a more agile-ish approach to this that's very business-focused, team-based, empirical, iterative, and adaptive. So you can get this book from Rosenfeld Media. The key word here, particularly with respect to CDPs, is empirical, that you can and should use a test-based selection process rather than just sitting through a demo and watching the vendor do it. You definitely want to get hands-on, put in, if you have to, billions of dummy records and take it for a test drive. There's all kinds of interesting ways that vendors differentiate, not just on architecture, but also in terms of, business use case. Typically, we know from other software marketplaces that different vendors target, explicitly or not, specific business use cases. And if we look at the 10 canonical ones, and these are the ones we use when we're evaluating CDP vendors in our research, the typical CDP vendor excels on 2, 3, maybe 4 of these, kind of touches on 2, 3 more, and typically doesn't really address the other 2 or 3 at all. And that's okay. You want that kind of focus. The key thing then for you is to figure out which use cases are most important for you and then match up against the right vendors. And this is, in fact, what our own Real Quadrant tool does, is allows you to put in both your the scenarios that are most important to you and then weight them, and then also the strategic considerations with respect to a vendor that are most important and weight them as well. And then we generate not a static magic quadrant or wave, but a real quadrant based on your specific needs and interests. And then, of course, you get direct access to the insider research that we give that talks to you about not just the real strengths, but the real weaknesses of these vendors as well. Let's wrap up with some key takeaways, and already several questions have come in, so we'll jump to those as well. A lot of text on this slide. Just wanted to make sure that if there was one thing you came away with, is that CDPs are increasingly foundational to an omni-channel stack, but they're not ends in themselves. So, we're increasingly sort of steering our subscribers away from saying, hey, I got to go get a CDP, towards what would you do with a CDP and how is it going to fit? And along the way, as customers mature, so are vendors, and sorting out into different categories. But as Apoorv mentioned, particularly the extent to which they will or will not take on data processing and management services. And so to that extent, it really falls to you to consider the proper scope of the CDP within your stack. And that could be with looking backwards into your data fabric, looking adjacent to services like personalization, and then with respect to engagement services like outbound marketing. We have different opinions about this based on your specific circumstances. This is a very common sort of advisory session for us. You definitely want to avoid unifying the customer record in a single departmental silo, and that includes marketing. So the big risk for you here is that if the only place where you unify a customer record is in your CDP, then you need to anticipate that a lot of other enterprise units within your enterprise may need access to that CDP, and it may not have been designed to serve as a kind of a master data management environment in that capacity. As you look to select a CDP, always employ an agile-oriented selection process that features adaptive testing. And the good news is that the CDP marketplace, unlike Game of Thrones, is likely to remain highly active for some time. The vendors are not going away. So that's good. You have a lot of choices there, but you want to prioritize your business scenarios as your prime criteria. And that's certainly an area where we can help you at Real Story Group. And more generally, I'll note that we've been advising really dozens of large enterprises over the past couple of years on their CDP choices. And it has been a very interesting, sometimes humbling experience, but a very rich experience as well. And we've seen a lot of success when a company ends up with a good fitting solution. It doesn't guarantee them success, but it also means that your technology is not getting in the way of what you're trying to do. And we've definitely seen CDPs, kind of version 1 CDPs, sometimes get in the way of what an enterprise is trying to do rather than actually empower them. So once again, there's 3 ways we can help you. One is you can license our research and get access to our decision-making tools to generate a real quadrant and then dive deep on those vendors. Some of our subscribers do what we call full stack subscription, where they subscribe to all of our research and we help them with broader stack decision-making. And we also have a private peer-led council of MarTech leaders that meets every 6 to 8 weeks, and we tackle some really tough subjects. We've been getting into personalization. Our next session is on marketing attribution, which I'm really excited about. We usually have at least one B2B and one B2C case study. So if you're curious about that, feel free to contact this man, and he's going to just talk about next steps, Scott, here, while Apoorv and I look over the questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, we are always interested in having new folks join us for the Stack Leadership Council. So if that's something that's of interest to you, please let me know. Happy to get on the phone and chat with you more about that and share some further details about our next meeting on December 9th about marketing attribution. We also have another webinar scheduled in early December on selecting the right dam to power your omni-channel ambitions. So if that's something you or your colleagues are thinking about, please join us for that. And Tony, I'll turn back to you. As you mentioned, there are many questions.
Yeah.
To tackle those.
The first one I'll take, and then the second one I'll hand off to you, Apoorv. So Jason is asking, I think historically the web has been the de facto anchor in the MarTech world for many of us. But in the world we live in now, where do you see that drifting towards? Is customer data really becoming the new center? That's a really interesting question, Jason. And we actually, one of the frameworks we use sometimes is the MarTech Mall with anchors and boutiques. And I think a web content management and your website in general will always be one anchor in that. But, you know, we definitely see the weight shifting towards data. That customer data is becoming the new center. And I think it's really table stakes to get your customer data house in order. The thing is that I think we're all learning that it requires much more than a CDP to do that. So the next question is from David, and Apoorv, I'm gonna hand this one over to you. You may cover this, but if you're a so-called suite customer like Salesforce, Adobe, et cetera, and have a need for both processing-oriented and engagement-oriented solutions, what's the best approach to tackle this problem?
Well, I think the best approach would be to not go with the CDP of the suite provider just because it is part of the suite, right? So look at the CDP of that suite provider for its own capabilities, compare it with best of breed CDP players, because CDP needs to be independent part of your architecture and not really bound to the suite itself. Now, having said that, I think the exact answer will also depend on which exact suite you have. Some of them have CDP capabilities which are complemented by other products in their suite. So you might get some data capabilities or the data centric capabilities from CDP, but you might get the remaining engagement capabilities from rest of the products in their suite. So an Adobe would be an example of that, right? So it really depends. There is no one single answer for that.
Right, that's right. It depends. In some cases, though, they are really tightly bound, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
So I'll take this next question from a Asif who's asking, multi-brand companies have yet another challenge. Edge mini data stores are default solutions, and the concept of one CDP becomes almost irrelevant as each brand ecosystem has varying requirements. Fast-moving consumer goods to personalization-focused rich brands. What to prioritize? Well, that's a great question, and we definitely see this a lot with FMCG, and then other more brand-oriented, and then of course sometimes there's some companies that span across B2B and B2C or have a channel involved, and it starts becoming a complicated question. We tend to think that there can be a CDP that can solve 80% of the use cases. Where you do, of course, run into problems is where some of these brands, sometimes even for legal reasons, depending on how they're configured, need to have their own data store fenced off, or they have a radically different data model. And at that point, then, for better or worse, it does tend to push you towards the more processing-oriented CDP vendors that were in that middle box, because they're likely to better be able to split the repository into logical divisions, whereas some of the more activation-oriented CDPs, if you're going to have different data models or different entitlements models, they literally have you set up a separate instance of the platform, which is obviously what you're trying to avoid. So it's a complicated issue. We have worked with some consumer product goods where they've been able to find that 80% sweet spot, but you're certainly, I think you're right, you're not going to get to 100%. So John is asking about, the way that we differentiated the CDP offerings. I think of particularly in those two big categories. What types of customers typically gravitate to each? In other words, what type of could we generalize about what type of customer might want an activation-oriented CDP versus one that wanted a data management-oriented or a combo?
Well, one generalization that we can make is that customers who already have existing initiatives going on, existing enterprise and wide initiatives going on, they tend to gravitate towards activation-oriented CDPs because they are probably doing some of the data-oriented tasks elsewhere as part of their ecosystem. So maybe as part of their data warehouse or data lake or whatever. So they basically want to be able to use those capabilities not just for marketing but also for customer service, for some of the other use cases, and that is one generalization that we can make, I think.
That's right, and I think that it tends to be sort of larger versus medium-sized enterprise might also, some cases we've seen, like in retail, where there was an enterprise data fabric, but the marketing people were frustrated. They just couldn't get access to the people or the system. So they basically set up a parallel infrastructure. Now you can say that's not elegant, that's not the right way to do it, but it might have been their only choice. By the way, Rupinder asked a very similar question about how does this fit in and to your existing investments, and the answer is, of course, you ideally take into account your existing investments. Sometimes you can't. Sean is asking, all the CDP vendors say they have AI and machine learning capabilities, but provide little detail on that. How would you advise we measure a vendor's AI ML capabilities? This is a fascinating question, Sean, and we see this across all the different segments that we cover, including web content management, email service providers, CRM. Everyone has their own little AI ML subsystem that they bake in and to do all the magical stuff for you. And the issue is they're probably not going to be as good as any kind of enterprise ML ops that you're doing, because they're acting on typically a limited set of data, and they may not have access to all the signals and information that you might need to be able to make good recommendations. And so, we tend not to think too highly of it. Again, the one caveat I would give to what Apoorv mentioned is that for some organizations, the CDP might be the center of their data ecosystem, might be serving as a quasi-data lake, in which case it might make sense, if you don't have any other capabilities, to use the AI capabilities that come with a CDP vendor. So James is asking, final mile. Should a CDP provide final mile delivery capabilities, such as the task of site personalization or email, like an ESP? Apoorv, should a CDP do that?
Well, I think it's more of an architectural decision. In some cases, it does make sense for customers to use these capabilities from within a CDP. In other cases, it doesn't. Right. So I'm not sure whether CDP should provide that or not, but architecturally, it is a decision that lies elsewhere.
Yeah, it's interesting. We used to be very much opposed to that, James, just almost like on principle. But then we've seen some of our subscribers bundle these things successfully, at least in the near term, because it was very expedient to have these services so close to their data. It's not true for everyone, but in some cases, I think we make an exception around something that on the surface doesn't seem as architecturally elegant because it's too tightly coupled. Great. I know there's more questions coming in, but we are way over time. Really appreciate everyone chiming in today. Feel free to contact us at the coordinates above if you'd like to continue the conversation. But for now, on behalf of Apoorv, Scott, and myself, thank you from Real Storage Group, and we'll catch you later. Bye now.
Bye.